Good morning. My name is Arezki Daoud. I am the editor of the Boston-based North Africa Journal and the managing editor of MEA Risk Assessment Services. These are businesses that service corporations and governments involved or interested in North Africa, with focus on both economic risks and opportunities, as well as on domestic and regional politics. We do not focus exclusively on oil and gas, but I can assure you the same concerns security folks in oil infrastructures have are also shared by many, many others who are on the ground or maybe comfortably sitting in offices in Paris, London, or New York and have committed investments in such industries as finance, telecommunications, cement, pharmaceuticals, etc. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me to present. It is an honor because I know many of the presenters and I'm conscious of them being great practitioners and security experts. We are here today to provide you with great insights and I hope to share some practical thoughts relevant to your business. The agenda today is rather straightforward. It consists of 5 broad themes specifically focused on the Maghreb and the Sahel regions. This means that Egypt is not included, and for those who consider Sudan as part of North Africa, it is also not included. I will start with mapping the security issues in North Africa based on one of our services that we call Critical Incidents Tracker. I will identify the most affected regions, the types of security challenges, and the degrees of impact these events have on regional stability, directly or indirectly impacting the conduct of business activity. I will review each type of event in a little more detail, then bring added emphasis on the 3 big insurgency groups active in the region. Finally, I will close with some thoughts on what could help companies establish a better and more secure presence before final conclusions. Let me start my discussion with the map of incidents in North Africa, which, as you can see here, shows a pretty busy landscape of events. In less than 30 days, we have inventoried almost 60 events of critical nature. These are the most visible events that we were able to track, and so one should assume that more is happening in places where tracking is difficult and where it is where having human assets is very difficult as well. Incidents in the way we look at the region are those that could have an impact on the stability of the country where they are happening. Indeed, they may already be the very cause of instability in the region. They are also events that are disruptive to the conduct of business. They may or may not affect oil and gas infrastructure per se, but if not directly, they are certainly relevant in an indirect way and must be analyzed in terms of their potential impact. Critical Incidents Tracker is a service that is part of MEA Risk, which is a sister company of the North Africa Journal. It was designed precisely to help us identify where events are located, what's their severity, and it is used in our analysis to determine consequences and outcomes. A bird's eye view of the region suggests that the incidents are concentrated in 2 big clusters. The first cluster is Cluster A to the north central, where there is a heavy concentration of critical events along the Mediterranean Sea and slightly south of it. This is where essentially the capitals of Libya and Tunisia are located, 2 countries that underwent major political upheaval over the past 2 years. Within that cluster, but on its lower side, is where the Algeria-Libya-Tunisia borders meet, a region that has seen so many incidents and is now the subject of intense military activity. Cluster B to the south relates to the destabilization of Central and Western Sahel within the Greater Sahara region, mostly Mali, but potentially other nations. These events' locations may seem adjacent to many North Africa's oil facilities, but they're also at the heart of the uranium mining world and other extraction activities or industries, in particular in Niger. So what happens here is very important for the security of oil infrastructure in the long run. Having been a neglected area for so long, the region features a collection of bad news, from the presence of terrorist organizations to the proliferation of criminal activity and illegal migration. The other areas show a number of incidents, albeit often isolated in nature, all the way to the Spanish and Italian territories up north due to illegal migration and humanitarian problems. In our ongoing and continuous tracking efforts, we capture a number of data points, as you can see on this slide, which boil down to factors that can help us assess incidents, concentration of these incidents in a region, categories of incidents, the severity, and other features. We are currently developing new features that enable us to do analytics and eventually help us in attempting to do forecasting. But today we feel we have at least 4 major variables to start our assessment, beginning with the incidence categories. Then there is the degree of severity of these events, and then their location. Our analysts collectively agreed that most security events and incidents can be grouped into 6 categories. They are the domestic and regional politics, the economy and business grouped together under one category. Then we also have human issues, international issues, security and defense, and finally terrorism. All of these categories, we believe, may be sufficient to group most, if not all, of the events we see occurring in a region. The intensity of these events is also tracked, and that's where analyst intuition plays an important role in determining the severity of an incident. These events are also location-based, and so that helps us assess which region is more affected and which region is less affected. Speaking of location and looking at the past 30 days of activity, there is no doubt that Libya tops the chart when it comes to the concentration of problems. Almost 1 out of 3 events we consider critical to stability in the Maghreb occurred actually in Libya. And unlike other places, terrorism and security issues tend to dominate overwhelmingly. Mali is the second hotspot. The jihadist offensive earlier this year prompted a French intervention, and that has had an impact on the changing strategic approach of the Islamist insurgents, who will be looking for more covert operation instead of direct confrontation going forward. Tunisia is third, and that's where almost 21% of what we consider critical events has occurred over the past 30 days. While the political crisis is freezing economic activity, it is also creating a security vacuum, or rather an opportunity for the jihadists to attempt to impose their views. In Algeria, both the domestic and regional contexts are creating a greater degree of uncertainty, while the rest of the region seems to enjoy lower degrees of problems in general. So when we talk about incident types, we refer to the ones that may have a significant impact on a nation's stability or a company's ability to conduct business. There is plenty of evidence, as suggested by the data that we've captured, that terrorism activity remains the biggest problem in the region, accounting for more than 41% of the near 60 incidents we have logged over the past 4 weeks. Since the launch of the North Africa Journal in 1996, the past 2 years have seen a peak of terrorism in the region, excluding Algeria, which obviously saw massive amounts of terrorism activity in the 1990s. Today, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Mali, and Niger combined have been sort of the center of growing incidents of terror-related activity. The political crises affecting these nations do not help either. Issues related to future governance models, ideology, generational feuds, issues of leadership, gender issues, etc., are major political topics of contention in all of these countries. Some are even dealing with local communities, calling for the dismantling of a central government in favor of decentralization of governance. In some of these nations, the concentration of power is itself source of major problems, and so as dysfunctional politics dominates, they act as drivers or enablers of security issues, which in the worst case scenarios, these security issues become front and center in general. You'll also notice that migration problems are cited as the third biggest problem in our assessment of stability. This may not affect oil and gas infrastructure directly, as discussed in this conference, but it is worth mentioning that there are always correlations that exist between those involved in human smuggling and human trafficking and other types of criminal and terrorist activities, including those that have targeted oil infrastructure. The existence of one, sadly, helps sustain the other. And so when law enforcement and military focus their attention on the terrorist risks, they should clearly remember the symbiotic relationship such terrorists have with the broader criminal elements active in other areas. A quick note on the other two categories: human issues unrelated to migration remain very important, although they account for 7% of the incidents. In this category, issues can be better handled with more effective corporate social responsibility for the oil and gas companies and the engineering companies and other companies that are active in the region. And on the security and defense front, it is also and often about nations that are feuding at the regional level. For example, Algeria and Morocco arguing over the Western Sahara territory comes to mind first. On the economic front, it is about economic policy that often act as a major inhibitor to growth and becomes inevitably a major driver to risks. In assessing the severity of what we consider critical incidents for North Africa, we conclude that collectively the region is going through a low-intensity crisis. How did we conclude that, and what does that mean? Well, first, for each of the events logged into our database, a rate of between 1 and 5 is assigned to that event by the analyst, whereby 1 is or has a low degree of impact, yet remaining relevant to the broad security environment, and 5 being the most severe level of intensity. For instance, an outbreak of malaria in the town of Gardaya, south of Algeria, killing 10, might have a material impact on stability, in particular if malaria happens to be more widespread, causing a crisis of sort. But its impact on broad stability is limited and warrants a 1 to 2 stars rating, depending on the analysts who cover that particular region. In contrast, the toppling of a Muammar Gaddafi is such a severe outcome that it ought to be considered as a 5-star incident. An incident like the In Amenas attack would have a 3 to 4 star, 3 star if the event were localized and without major implications, and 4 if that leads to civilian deaths and investors' withdrawal from the region. Again, these are figures and rates that are assigned by analysts, and they do their best judgment to come up with a proper rating. You'll be surprised to learn that collectively the near 60 incidents of the past 4 weeks rated slightly below 1.8 on a scale of 1 to 5, with, as I said, 5 being the most severe possibility. Although that incident degree might sound counterintuitive, given all the news we hear about the region, it is, however, a certainly logical rating or logical state of rating. Most of the events, if not all, have really not led to a systemic failure in the region. No single event can lead to the collapse of government, although a few events shook the foundation of the existing governments for sure. But all in all, what we see happen in the long term is a chipping away of the basic elements of governance and security in those countries through a variety of low-intensity events. So again, low-intensity events are helping chip away the foundation of most of these governments in these countries, and that has certainly a long-term impact. For those behind the terror, this is like a low-heat barbecue where the end result is much more efficient than if it were a full-blown fire. This low-intensity degree of incidence has a long-term devastating impact because it is often difficult to find the source of the fire and extinguish it quickly. On the terrorism front, this low-intensity burn, as I call it, is very much in line with a white paper we published in January 2010 titled "The Big Jelly Ball of Global Insecurity: Terrorism is Now a Permanent Fixture." In this document, we argued that as global terrorism is likely to remain with us for a long time, it will manifest itself in the form of small-scale acts of terror that will take place in one area, die down for a while, just as to create a certain level of comfort. Then when the dust settles, another attack elsewhere would take place. This is, as we try to illustrate it, the equivalent of having a giant ball of jelly placed above your head, which you are holding with your hands on each side. The problem for you is that just as you think you're controlling the right side, the left side of it begins to drip and fall. Now you quickly rush to control the left side, only to realize that the back is also slowly dripping, and so on and so forth. How do you control that remains certainly a big and difficult balancing act. And in the case of North Africa, it's really no surprise that virtually all major military assets are being used to control the big jelly ball. Obviously, the intensity of the crisis tends to be different from one country to another. It is generally lower in countries that have a strong military and a lot of experience, as well as stable to semi-stable governments and a lot of financial resources, such as Algeria, where it is below 1.4, and Libya and Tunisia, where it peaks at 2. Our plan going forward is the ability to give our customers such assessment tools to perform comparisons on a weekly basis, and hopefully at the local level as well. Let me switch gear to provide you with an inventory of some of the key issues we see in the region, and it could be a problem in corporate security and beyond. On the political front first, there are at least 5 big concerns that companies and others need to be mindful and consider when making their own assessment. Firstly, the biggest issue by far these days is the transition from the Gaddafi era to the new Libya. It is no secret that the toppling of Gaddafi has created a severe governance and security vacuum that no one seems to be able to control. The outcome of the Libyan revolution was probably easy to predict. This is because Gaddafi left with a nation that has no institutions and without a unifying personality, and the country was naturally headed toward a disastrous transition. The presence of out-of-control militias can be fixed with the proper incentive packages, but that's not enough. Millions of Libyans want autonomous regions in a federalist-like model that resembles that of the United States, Germany, Switzerland, etc., and where central government no longer dictates from Tripoli. We see this debate move into a dangerous, violent phase, driven by leaders in many regions, in particular the northeastern region of Cyrenaica, wanting to be autonomous from Tripoli to the west, even using military means and others. Then the presence of a so-called Ansar Sharia and other religious, political, militant groups that are inevitably a long-term problem for Libya, and fortunately such problem becomes or is only a law enforcement type of problem. There is very little to negotiate. These organizations don't have a lot of political clout. They're essentially there to create more problem, and therefore can be handled on the law enforcement level. The third biggest problem for Libya is its tribes and ethnic groups localized in the specific regions. These tribal issues translate into a real headache for those of you in charge of securing oil and gas facilities and terminals. Not only there is the terrorist factor always in the minds of businesses, but tribes have been demanding better allocation of resources and control over oil and gas operations. And when they don't get what they want, they force a freeze in activity, as we have seen with oil export terminals shutting down recently, threatening exports to Italy. Unfortunately, and I'm sad to say, the current Libyan government has no resources, has no capabilities, and even legitimacy in the eyes of many to bring about a clean consensus to fix the nation's problems. What we recommend Libya and its biggest partners is to consider decentralizing governance through a federated state model. In doing so, with the central government overseeing the process of decentralizing on one hand and key functions such as defense, foreign affairs on the other, provincial governments and local tribes, local militias, etc., will feel as being part of the solution and not left aside as it happened during the Gaddafi era, and in fact virtually in every other Arab country. In Tunisia, the problems are different. There is a central government where, but it's almost like what happened in Egypt during the Morsi presidency. A substantial portion of the Tunisian people simply does not want an Islamist-leaning government, and so there is a big fight happening as we speak over what form of government Tunisia should take. And that also means frozen governance, declining economy, and Islamist insurgents seeking to destabilize the country. We have recorded many military operations and subsequent arrests and eliminations of alleged terrorists in many Tunisian regions, and in particular along the porous Tunisian-Libyan borders, while the Algeria-Tunisia border today looks like a military base of sort. So much is happening there with a lot of military assets that would-be terrorists are finding it very difficult to cross from one country to another. In neighboring Algeria, the risk is less on the security front, more on the political front. The ill 76-year-old President Bouteflika may be running for a fourth term in April 2014, and after an optimistic start in 1999 when he was first elected president, the past years were dominated by a series of crises that showed the limit of his capabilities as an effective leader. In the oil and gas sector specific to this conference, it has been about massive corruption scandals affecting oil firm Sonatrach and the Ministry of Energy and Mining. The country's $80 billion investment plan for the oil and gas sector to 2016 is heavily compromised by the country's law that prevents foreign investors from owning more than 49% equity in a project. Then there is the In Amenas terrorist attack that further dealt a blow to an industry that virtually feeds the entire country. But I would argue that not all of that is lost. Obviously, we have presidential election coming up in the second quarter of 2014. But as leading companies foreign companies continue to put pressure on Algeria on the security front, it's worth noting that the country is upping its defenses and offense capabilities, currently moving nearly 25,000 troops along the Libya border to stop incursions that could hit oil facilities. A potential $10 billion military contract is being negotiated with Russia, and we're likely to see the rise of the use of Chinese drones in the desert to keep an eye on oil facilities, while certainly going after some of the military targets coming from insurgents and terrorist groups. So major investments are being made, but the real test is clearly the post-April 2014 elections. Another hotspot is the diplomatic feud pitting Morocco to Algeria over the Western Sahara territory. For those of you who do not know about this conflict, it is about Morocco wanting to annex the Western Sahara territory, as I said, located on the Atlantic, northwest Africa. That's ever since Spain left in the 1970s, and Algeria supporting the independence movement fighting against Morocco. Why this diplomatic feud is important? Well, it is because security cooperation between the two nations is at its lowest, as the two countries could easily collaborate to eliminate all sorts of threats in the Sahara and between them. Instead, their borders remain a potential for risks, and yet very little is invested in solving their common crises and reduce the risk factor. Finally, Mali is a hotspot. Mali, where a French intervention early this year to stop an Islamist takeover of the southern provinces may have yielded nothing good for the long term. Mali is important because an insurgency base there could threaten the oil facilities in southern Algeria, could threaten the mining facilities in Niger and elsewhere, and far beyond in the greater North Africa and Sub-Sahara. There is clearly a highway of terrorism also linking Mali, where weapons are needed, to southern Libya, where weapons are in abundance. Again, these are some of the these are probably, from our perspective, the top 5 big political events that are worth watching and analyzing ahead of a security analysis. Economic risks are numerous too, and so I will focus on the ones that create an environmental instability. Starting with spending. Spending is on the rise. Although it is necessary to spend in an effort to buy social peace and reduce discontent, maintaining high levels of spending, as we see happening in virtually all North African countries, could create major economic instability that governments will be dealing with sooner or later. It is understandable, however, that all governments would want to increase their contribution to subsidizing food, energy, commodities, etc. And that's clearly in an effort to avoid a social backlash amid the Arab Revolution. Any reduction of such subsidies could lead to social explosion in nations that are extremely fragile. But the consequences in the long term will be negative, and that could create real tension. Secondly, exports are down, and that means lower revenue, less jobs, and millions of young people without clear prospects. Countries like Morocco and Tunisia are facing weak export markets as the EU, being their biggest customer, struggles with no growth economies. With reduced activity in the EU, industries in the region are bound to witness a reduction in activity. The Arab Springs affecting these markets also meant a sharp decrease in tourism activity. Less foreign tourists mean hotel closure. The most recent news on that came from Club Med in Hammamet, Tunisia, that decided to shut down due to lack of tourist activity. That sends a pretty bad signal to the rest of the tourism industry and clearly to the potential tourists that it is unsafe, it is not a good place to visit, and that has certainly major complications in terms of the economic outlook and the potential risks on the security front. Frozen reforms, a third point. Obviously, with intense political crises, sound economic policies moved to the backseat. All the major economic reforms announced before 2011 had to be thrown out the window. We found ourselves in an era where it is often difficult to find a government official or an administrator willing to even make very simple decision. Number 4, frozen oil and gas activity, where Libya is the most affected given the demands being made by the local communities over wealth distribution, the role of autonomous militias in securing oil sites, and the fights that result in such competition between militias and between tribes. In neighboring Algeria, the In Amenas attack is a source of tension between the Algerian government and foreign oil companies, which are not completely eager to resume activity there. And so the industry is in a state of freeze, and some even see it as in a state of decay. On the human front, obviously we're looking at an explosion of problems. In addition to the confrontation pitting ideologies against one another, or along gender lines, religious lines, generational lines, there are consequences of all these problems affecting the broad security environment in North Africa and the Sahel. Obviously, we have seen substantial population displacements in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, particularly affecting Libya first. In Mali, too, the crisis there led to population displacements, and illegal migration remains the biggest source of loss of life. We do certainly recall the hundreds of people killed on the Mediterranean during their journey from North Africa to Europe using substandard boats, sinking along the Italian or the Spanish coasts. But there's also the less known deaths of migrants who perish in the Sahara while searching for a better and safer place. So in this case, the Libyan and Niger's deserts tend to be a hot spot, and the Mediterranean crossings off the coast of Libya and Morocco tend to be also a major problem up north. The end of dictatorial regimes opened up a Pandora's box of sort on the tribal ethnic front. Conflicts have been brewing for decades in the region, where they were never allowed to be debated. What we see today are tribal and ethnic demands that are transforming into full-blown crises. In Libya, virtually all regions with their respective tribal affiliations have demands that often translate into conflicts with governments and with other tribes. In Algeria, whether it is in the central region of Gardaya, where the Berber Mozabites often clash with the nearby Arab tribe of Arabic descent. Near the Mali border on the Algerian side as well are the Tuaregs of African descent fighting against the Tuareg of Arab descent over the situation of their ethnic peers in Mali, and so on and so forth. These events may not necessarily affect oil infrastructure directly, but could have certainly major implications if not solved. For example, we know that tribes have been competing and clashed with one another over who would provide security services in oil and gas facilities in Libya. Clearly, these are problems that need to be addressed, or at least comprehended and understood by the primary stakeholders in oil infrastructure. Then, with the weakness of government courtesy of all these crises, old diseases that have apparently disappeared decades ago have actually returned, including malaria with the combination of unsafe water and uncontrolled human migration. Another critical element that is feeding into the rise of security problems may very well be linked to not just governments that have neglected the regions that produce oil, but could also be linked to companies involved in extraction, whether they are active in oil, gas, phosphates, uranium, and other minerals. Many such companies have done very little to create a real substantial sustainable business model at the local level. There has been certainly the occasional sponsorship of a clinic or a school, but they're largely symbolic in the eyes of the local population and bring no real positive impact for the local communities, but create a certain degree of animosity towards that particular investor or company. Such animosity obviously could easily turn into unwanted negative attention or action if foreign companies are perceived as doing very little or siding with the central governments, which remain highly unpopular. Unfortunately, in these parts of the world, guilt by association is often the reason why local populations could become a source of security problems themselves. On the international front, Western governments in particular tend to analyze the region using three focal points. The first is the obvious economic angle, with oil, gas, uranium, phosphates, and other mineral extraction activities at the center. The second focal point is security. That peak of Western government contribution in the region happens to be more on the military front and intelligence front than anything else. And thirdly, European nations in particular include illegal migration or migration in general as central to their policy of engagement with North Africa. When you analyze a region under these lenses, the lenses of these three factors, it seems to me that no good creative ideas are put forward. More recently, at least two Gulf nations have been moving front and center and seeking to influence policy in the region in an effort to construct their own sphere of influence as these nations undergo a transition and move towards what they hope to achieve is stabilization. Without naming names specifically about these particular countries, observers have been raising red flags about alleged support of Salafist and jihadist organization supported by one monarchy, Gulf monarchy, or the other, often competing with one another. These two particular nations from the Gulf have had a very negative impact on the way North African nations are negotiating their future governments, and that's a problem that's not likely to to disappear anytime soon. In a final analysis, setting aside the Gulf monarchies that are moving into North Africa, the West in particular holds enormous influence over the region. It is inconceivable to see any progress in Mali, for example, without Paris, France, being the architect of that move. Washington and London are very influential in Libya, as another example. These Western powers ought to have a much more comprehensive approach to securing the region, using other things in addition to security, oil, gas, and migration in general. Then you have what I consider to be the big elephant in the room, and that is terrorism. All of the issues cited in previous slides, including the role of Western governments and Gulf monarchies, feed into the terrorism agenda. It is without any doubt the beast that is hanging over everyone's head. The sources of these terrorist organizations are known by those who track them and by law enforcement. They generally comprise of low numbers of elements within autonomous organizations or semi-autonomous organizations that are linked to one another through ideological common denominator and a worldwide leadership that seeks to unify them in purpose. The various organizations generally have a localized agenda and recruit members at the local level while also utilizing militants who come from other regions. But generally, they are small groups and their aim is to inflict pain. I say that because they don't seem to have a negotiable political agenda per se. None of these organizations has a political arm that would negotiate a political solution to a crisis the way Sinn Féin did in the Northern Ireland case. Lack of a political arm is a problem in that the crisis has no end in sight, and an end to it has to come through violent confrontation instead of dialogue. There is no time frame. The attacks can be strategic at times and sometimes random. They can be seemingly politically motivated, as in the case of the In Amenas gas facility attack, and sometimes driven by financial motives, as in the case of the many kidnappings of Europeans for ransom. The groups can grow and can split. The leadership is often versatile. You can eliminate one leader, another one emerges pretty quickly, etc. In assessing the insurgencies, who are the ones behind the elongated crisis in North Africa? Firstly, it is worth noting that the region's insurgencies are well coordinated by Al-Qaeda Central, even though they are seemingly autonomous and often responsible for their own finances. They share common long-term strategy and ideology, but their tactics may be very different and are adapted to fit the requirements of the geographies where they operate individually. Under this view, they can be considered as the equivalent of real subsidiaries, business subsidiaries equivalent for Al-Qaeda Central, where their primary task is to simply disrupt. Here are some of the most active. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM. Its sphere of influence is highlighted in red on this map, and that means it is able to collaborate with other more localized or institutions or organizations, or even compete with them. AQIM is an organization that gets its origin from Algeria, where it has rebranded itself as part of Al-Qaeda after the Algerian military managed to choke it in the 1990s, and in an effort to affect other North African nations, but also seeking to recruit in Europe. Its leaders, who have pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda, hence the change of name from GSPC to AQIM, generally come from Algeria and draw their skills from decades of fighting within Algeria. After focusing their combat operation in the northern coastal areas, they were progressively forced out of the north to settle in the vast desert and onto the Sahel. Kidnapping of European nationals for ransom has been a key contributor to their financial resources, which can be counted in the tens of millions of dollars if one sums up the amounts of money European governments have paid to free their nationals. Within AQIM, small entities with their own leaders control their respective regions and areas. Their leaders may have different operational modes and tactics. Some are more ideological and religious driven, and may be more inclined on eliminating the kidnapped to punish the West. Others are more business-minded and may be focused more on getting money from kidnapping. Where do they operate? Well, clearly everywhere in the region. They tend to be the preferred proxy of Al-Qaeda Central, and so their expertise is used everywhere possible. The second one to watch is so-called Ansar al-Sharia. In Libya and Tunisia, we're witnessing the rise of Ansar al-Sharia, used by Al-Qaeda Central to open a new operational front in Northeast Africa, a region that used to be heavily controlled by the security forces of the now defunct regimes of Ben Ali in Tunisia and Gaddafi in Libya. Ansar al-Sharia, which has also a small presence in Mali, is alleged to be behind a killing in Libya of an American ambassador and many others, and in Tunisia it is often orchestrating terrorist attacks against government targets, foreign embassies, and opposition figures. In both Libya and Tunisia, Ansar al-Sharia acts as a rising sister organization of AQIM, which is better suited to operate in Northwest Africa and in the Sahel-Sahara region in general. Political assassinations in Tunisia could be easily traced to Ansar. As its name suggests, finally, the movement of oneness and jihad in West Africa, referred to often as Mujao, is active on the Western Front, although it is said that it traces its origin to AQIM. Splitting from that organization in 2011, the two probably coordinate and collaborate for mutual interest, just like they probably do with Ansar al-Sharia to the east. Probably the best collaboration between Mujao and AQIM came in the form of a joint attack against the now famous In Amenas terror attack facility in South Algeria in early 2013. Although it is often tempting to blame terrorists for all our ills, the reality is that when it comes to underperforming economies, weak job figures, cumbersome administrations, corruption, etc., the political systems in place could be much more problematic than just the security, the terrorist issues that we're seeing in the region. In fact, if you juxtapose Algeria's oil facility infrastructure map to the left of the slide, comprising of such sites as refineries, treatment plants, oil terminals, etc., with the past 4 weeks of critical incidents, there is absolutely no single terror attack directly targeted to oil facilities. This suggests that despite the In Amenas incursion of early 2013, generally oil and gas facilities remain highly secured. And so the risk for companies active in Algeria may not be so high after all on the terrorism front if good security plans are put in place. But they come from different types of issues, political and of human nature in general. Specific to Libya, in most cases, if not all of the 4 past weeks, security issues are not terrorist related, but rather due to the very difficult political transition pitting all the key stakeholders there. The role of the militias and the role of the tribes in competing for attention and resources are probably the most disruptive factors in this picture. And obviously, an effective political settlement to the Libyan crisis is the only way out. Let me move to share some thoughts on corporate security posture in light of all these different problems that we're seeing in North Africa. First, I have to say that top experts on security are here in the conference, and they could provide you with a much better assessment on preparedness than myself. But what I could add to your discussion is that in the North Africa context, it is never wise to assume one has foolproof security procedures. It is a fast-moving geopolitical landscape requiring constantly evolving protective tactics and improving defensive postures. You might have a clear security strategy based on practical actions and investments that raise your security, that raise your corporate profile within the communities. But corrective measures have to be applied on the regular basis if one wants to avoid potential problems. The 2 major oil countries in the Maghreb region have different positions and actions on securing oil and other economic infrastructure. Libya is the most problematic nation, I think everybody agrees. It has many stakeholders and a weak central government. Cyrenaica to the east is virtually independent. The central government is struggling to maintain control there, but it cannot afford to fight the local federalists without risking a full-blown civil war. So foreign companies active in the east must obviously now deal with not only an inactive or an ineffective central government, but also the rising federalists at the local level. Elsewhere in Libya, copycats have emerged, and other regions are making their own demands, including the Amazigh Berbers, who are demanding their recognition, and primarily the recognition of their culture before they ease any oil activity in the south. To be very honest with you, these sorts of crises, where local populations make their own demand as the future of the country is being discussed, contribute to the proper outcome of the crisis. You need that kind of input to move forward. Most in the media talk about gloom and doom scenario without a central government, but it is my own estimation that not bringing autonomy to the regions and recreating a powerful central government simply mean going back to square one. In neighboring Algeria, the attack against the In Amenas facility in early 2013 came as a major surprise, but it has unveiled serious weaknesses in the Algeria's protective capabilities, forcing oil companies and their insurance firms to reassess their presence there, and that means delaying business activity. So how does a company deal with such different levels of crisis? There are certainly great limitation in what a company can do, obviously, but also many things that could help limit the risk. Because of the complexity of the Libyan political landscape, Frankly, the companies that have withdrawn from there for the time being should not be blamed. There is really no good amount of protective or private security, risk management techniques, or firepower that could face an angry insurgency that is highly political or religiously motivated. For example, the Cyrenaican Defense Forces or Defense Force linked to the self-declared autonomous government in northeast Libya has nearly 20,000 troops. Your contract might be with the central government, but how can you avoid dealing with the autonomous entity? Deploying security personnel along pipelines, as much as it is important, is even more dangerous than in fixed facilities. So if you are the head of security at an oil company, you must often think that the risks of your presence there far outweigh the short-term benefits of a direct presence. Still, having a direct presence in Libya, even and albeit minimal, is important for any oil or engineering company. Therefore, beefing up protective capabilities are not only important, but must come with building intelligence capabilities within the accepted legal framework. We have seen recently an uptick in the hiring of intelligence analysts on the ground by a variety of companies, not just by oil firms, but also by other types of industrial investors and companies. These analysts could certainly help you build a more solid risk management toolkit. Finally, let me emphasize the need to learn about the various emerging political stakeholders. To the chagrin of the central government, politically motivated militias, the various tribes and ethnic groups, etc., cannot be ignored. They showed they are able to freeze activity, and the government cannot do much about it. However, this means that companies active in those regions must be close to the political leadership of these tribes. This is a big and costly learning curve, but one that is inevitable. Specific to Algeria, your stance there also requires some wait and see as the country gets closer to its April 2014 presidential elections. Regardless, the visible presence of private security is never a welcome thing. Algeria is very protective of its national sovereignty, and the very presence of foreign armed individuals and companies does not work. In fact, it's one of the few points that political leaders and the population generally agree on. But the government is fully aware that concrete steps have to be made in increasing security post in Amenas if it wants foreign companies in. The country has an $80 billion investment budget for its upstream, downstream, and oil transport investments. And for that, a $10 billion arm procurement is a cost worth spending. In fact, it is possible, based on our assessment, that some $12 billion will be spent on that, and that would include such oil protective systems as drones, new electronic surveillance systems, two-seat fighter bombers designed for tactical deployment against small and mobile targets in the Sahara. There are also discussions underway for the creation of 3 attack helicopter squadrons that would be deployed in and around oil facilities and elsewhere, in addition to moving troops along the problem borders and around oil facilities. As these investments are made, the Algerian Ministry of Defense is not always known to be communicative about that, and so having tighter line of communications with the Ministry of Defense or via the Ministry of Energy is very important for planning and preparedness for companies that are looking to improve their security posture in Algeria. Finally, regardless of where you are located, your corporate social responsibility rules, or CSR, should be applied even in these troubled areas. In our discussions with foreign investors of all sorts involved in the region, one common problem that seems to emerge all the time is the non-existence of a local middle management pool capable of operating an international business locally. So there's a great deal of use of foreign expatriates, and that spells potentially big trouble. What does that mean for you? Well, be part of the education system. There is no reason why a company should bring a procurement manager from the UK, France, Canada, the US, or Japan, or Korea, when a sound training program should enable to identify local graduates who would undergo training for future leadership positions on the ground. We have seen kidnappings of foreign expats, provide financial resources to terrorists, and in the worst case scenario, kidnappings end up in assassinations. These are heavy prices to pay, and frankly, better human resources investments and prioritizations are critical to security. Finally, CSR must also affect corporate image at the local level. It is mind-boggling to see the level of poverty in the provinces where oil, gas, uranium, phosphates, and other minerals are extracted. High unemployment, oil bases that are staffed with foreign workers but highly isolated from local communities. Limited investments may very well be caused by ineffective central government policies in those countries. But companies active there, in the eyes of the local populations, are guilty by association. Bypassing government bureaucrats and connecting with local communities will be increasingly important as calls for federalism get louder and louder. Using local executives to play that bridging role, that bridging role would be also very important. Finally, in closing, I wanted to include my contact information. I think that MEA Risk Services and Critical Incidents Tracker could be excellent tools to help you protect your assets in the region by understanding what is happening there and what may be the implications going forward. To reach me, the slide has the proper contact information, and I look forward to speaking with you directly at some point. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.